As you've heard me say many times, Jesus often surprises us. And he does it today with this parable. This parable we just listened to about two individuals who went up to the temple to pray. The two individuals praying are identified, one as a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The audience at the time that Jesus related this parable would have most likely compared the Pharisee and tax collector. They would have said of the Pharisee, "What a good guy, admirable, a religious man." And they would have said about the second, the tax collector, that he was despicable and dishonest and a traitor. Pharisees were lay people who dedicated themselves to trying to keep God's law as perfectly as they could. They lived in a very difficult time. They were under Roman occupation. In much of the Roman religious beliefs were sort of sneaking into their Jewish beliefs, and so they were left really working hard to stay true to their tradition. And they did it in an exaggerated way, the Pharisees. They did more than the law required. And they were always perceived as law-abiding citizens and, as I say, very religious. As devout Jews, they prayed 3 times in a day, even though it was required only once. And they often went to the temple and prayed standing with their arms outstretched or their eyes cast down or lifted to heaven, right up in the front. Mosaic law required all Jews to fast on the Day of Atonement once a year. But the Pharisees fast twice a week, 100 times more than was required of them. And they were very generous in tithing. Not only did they tithe 10% from their income, but as the gospel tells us, they tithe with 10% of their assets, all that they owned. 10% went to the temple. And so if you think of that, you have to think that the Pharisee was certainly righteous. He did righteous things, no doubt. Now the tax collector, he was not looked upon favorably by the community. I hope none of you are in the tax business, okay? He was a public employee of the hated Roman government, which Israel held with deep contempt. And they were contempted because of the fact that they had to pay this high tax to Rome. And as a fellow Jew, this tax collector was seen as a traitor to his own people. And he was accused not only of getting the tax, but adding another tax so that he would have some income and live a pretty comfortable life. So if we keep this in mind, the Pharisee and the tax collector, we will begin to understand why the audience may have been shocked that Jesus sees the tax collector as the one who went home justified. We normally would have probably thought of the Pharisee. Why is that? Well, notice the prayer that the Pharisee directs in his talking to God. He first of all draws attention to himself in his own accomplishments. He says, "I thank you that I am not like that guy behind me. I fast more than required. I give a lot beyond what I'm supposed to give." He thanks God not for the gifts he has been given, but he thanks God for not being like the rest of those morons behind him. And he sees them people as sinful. His comparison makes him haughty, disconnected from others. And more sadly, he appears to have no need of God in his life. I. The tax collector, in contrast, beats his breast and he prays simply, "Oh God, be merciful to me, a sinner." Focusing on God, he prays for openness to divine mercy. He knows he depends on God if he's ever going to be the good man that he wants to be, not as how he is perceived. I read an author talking about this parable, and he mentions that this parable was designed by Jesus as a kind of a trap. That Jesus was trying to trap that audience. And he does so in that very first line. He says, 2 men went up to the temple to pray, a Pharisee and a tax collector. We probably entered that trap a little bit. Well, it's got to be a Pharisee. Yeah. Pretty good guy. Not that tax collector. So those hearing Jesus would have presumed that the Pharisee prayed well, whereas the tax collector did not. But as we see, as the parable proceeds, we find the opposite is true. It is the tax collector who goes home justified, whereas the Pharisee does not. And so the parable reverses the customary roles of the characters. It overturns our own expectations. And so the parable, I think, can be viewed as really a warning against prejudging others. It warns about the quick judgments in which we base often our life. The word prejudice as a root comes from prejudging, because it is a prejudice to judge people without knowing them, not knowing who they are, where they come from, and what they think. And like it or not, we tend sometimes to judge people by their appearance, by the language they speak, by the clothes they wear, the jobs they hold. We stereotype them oftentimes. And that's certainly not what we ought to be doing. And we probably say, and I think it's probably mostly true, we might say, "I don't prejudge." Well, I'm going to see if I can trap you today. 2 people went to pray. One was a Democrat and the other a Republican. One's name was Brian Kelly and the other was Jim Harbaugh. Who said the better prayer? You think you know, but are you sure? 2 people went to church to pray. One was an American and the other an Iraqi. One was black. One was white. One was gay and the other was straight. One was a Catholic and the other an agnostic. If you think you know who said the better prayer, maybe we've fallen into the trap. Maybe without realizing it, we already formed a judgment about whose prayer was better. And I think that's the purpose of the parable, to make us think, to make us not judge people by what they look like, say, do. And we want to ask the Lord that we have His grace and the power to change from that immediate reaction and to look at people as they are, created by a merciful God.